On Tuesday, we celebrate our National Day at Tynwald. But what does it mean to be Manx these days? What makes up our character and identity? And indeed, does Manxness really matter anymore? Also, with the Scottish Government calling for a second referendum on independence, what would an independent Scotland mean for the Isle of Man? And indeed, would the Isle of Man be better off as a fully independent nation? I'm joined on the programme today by marketing expert Dr Simon Collister, poet Simon Maddrell, and Tynwald members Chris Thomas MHK and Paul Craine MLC. Simon Collister, you're a Manxman living away, but occasionally coming back to the island. You've been posting quite a lot on Twitter about the sort of cultural identity of the Isle of Man and why that's quite important. What's your interest in this area?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a Manx expat, as it were. Come back as often as I can, as often as the boats go and the planes fly, which has been a bit challenging this year. But I mean, I've always been into kind of the Isle of Man and our culture and our heritage. A passionate Manxman, as it were. And in my day job, which is kind of branding and advertising, we often talk a lot about identity, brands, place, location, and the importance of how we project ourselves, I guess. And I know, I think I've had a bit of an exchange on Twitter with yourself earlier in the year, which has possibly prompted some of these conversations, which was around, it was a reference to a fast show television comedy sketch from the 90s, which weekly kind of poked fun at two very unusual, a very unusual couple, usually in a caravan, making very bizarre statements and then kind of following it up with "We're from the Isle of Man," which has kind of persisted. And wherever you go, certainly in the UK, when you chat to people, that's often a reference point for the island, which is annoying to say the least. When there's so much more than kind of unusual, crude statements, and it's so it's a bit of a bugbear on a personal level. But I also was doing some work recently, writing up some of my own kind of personal interests in culture and literature, and looking at the Isle of Man's presence in particular the work of James Joyce, who this year we see is the 100th anniversary of his novel Ulysses, which has been variously coined as the greatest work of literature in the 20th century and the novel to end all novels kind of thing. So it's a hugely important work, and his other work has kind of been deemed to be some of the most kind of avant-garde and kind of powerful work in the kind of Western literature canon. And the Isle of Man was writ throughout all of his work. And it always struck me as a student years and years ago that this was fascinating, that kind of one of the most important literary figures in the 20th century has a real kind of strong affinity with the island and everything it stands for. And it kind of struck me that you've got kind of popular culture at the moment kind of mocking the island, but you've got kind of, other kind of literary culture. It was kind of like waxing lyrical about the island and all the things it stands for, and it was just quite striking, really. And that kind of then formed a bit of a riff on what do we think the island's identity is? What do we stand for in the minds of people who aren't from the Isle of Man? We've got, usually, if you're from the Isle of Man, you're usually really passionate about all the things that we have in our history and culture. But if you're not from the Isle of Man, what does it mean to you? And that kind of got me into a bit of a discussion with various people, including Charlie Higson from the Fast Show, who kind of apologised and said that he didn't really mean to poke fun at the Isle of Man. It was just something that had amused him at the time. And I think it may well have gone back to some of the more kind of unpleasant, not unpleasant, but kind of sad news coverage in the 90s about the legislation around homosexuality laws on the island. So that might have been kind of part of it. So you can kind of see how all of these kind of cultural references kind of come into the minds of the public and kind of and popular imagination, and it's just frustrating. You kind of, I bet if you went around and asked people in the UK or even globally what they thought of when you mention the Isle of Man, they'll probably list TT, cats with no tails, and possibly offshore finance or possibly money laundering or something colloquial like that, which for me is not incorrect, but it's the tip of the iceberg, right? And arguably, if you want to be renowned and known for certain qualities and have an identity about something, then there are much better things to be known about.
Well, you've dropped in there two excellent reasons why we should link through to our next guest. title yourself as the Manx queer poet, Simon Maddrell, another exile, but you've come back specially for this show, back to the Isle of Man and joining us in the studio, which is great. Yeah, I mean, when we're hearing James Joyce, who else but Simon Maddrell should we go to next?
Thank you. I am a Manx queer poet rather than the. Yeah, no, it was interesting hearing Simon talk about the Fast Show, because I've actually written about that exact subject, and and I think to be fair, the very clear reason why that was taken up by the Fast Show was because of the film that Ian McKellen made about the lack of legalisation for sex between men on the Isle of Man, and to be quite honest, I thought they were very kind to the Duggans, far kinder than they are in my poem. So I do recognise that one of my friends used to quote the Fast Show every single time he met me. Sort of, and that is sad. And we've got a lot more to celebrate. And if you're talking about the arts, the Cabinet of Curiosity that was launched at the Manx Museum, which is a great movement forward. But it didn't mention, even though we did in the opening, Dursley McLinden, a young Manx actor who popular culture was featured in an episode of Doctor Who, and sadly contracted HIV in the late 80s and died in 1994, but should be celebrated for how much energy and time he put in raising funds for other people with HIV and AIDS. And if we're talking about celebration of Manx people, that they are the sort of the people that we should be recognising as great products of the island, however nice it may be for Joyce to talk about us. And in many ways, I think T. Brown probably earned the right to be considered Manx, but I think the country would be it would be great to be looking to celebrate more of the people and the figures in the island.
And identity and identity politics, obviously that can work in relation to sexuality. It relates in terms of culture, also sort of national identity. Why are these sorts of concepts important to explore? Because obviously as a poet, that's very much your territory, isn't it? Looking at all these sort of issues and just trying to make sense of them, or maybe not, I don't know.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, I think many poets start off at a very personal level in terms of exploring perhaps their own traumas or their own experience, but then many of us move on then to explore ideas, that whole idea of identity. I mean, I touch on it a lot in my my first pamphlet, Throat Bone, which and my next pamphlet, which will be coming out next year, which is called The Whole Island, explores that relationship between the individual as a body, the island as a body, the land and the folklore and all of those things. They can be all interrelated, and they can be a metaphor for each other. I mean, in one particular area that really fascinates me is the not just the history of the island, but the identity of the island. I mean, it's very hard it would be very hard to deny that the Isle of Man is not a colonised country. Going way back to the Vikings and the Irish, and as T. Brown said, we became that football that was kicked around, and so I don't think anyone can deny that fact. I think the question is exploring that idea of whether Manx independence or greater autonomy, or if one wants to follow the lead of Boris Johnson taking back control, that fascinates me as well. And if I may, I'll just read a short poem that sort of looking at it at quite a very succinct level, but it's certainly an area that I would love to explore more. But it's called The Vikings Didn't Need Roads, to plunder and burn wooden vessels, graves, not tricks, a queer-shaped ball kicked back and down and over walls, without the love of Antinous. Rich dukes envied, stocks and barrels, no sooner grasped than sold, to be owned by George III in 1765. A hanging chalice. Freedom is an oxymoron. Flourishing is a drag queen when she owns herself.
Excellent. Paul Craine, how do you follow that? Well, one thing I would hope that you would follow that with. I mean, if you have a poem, we'd love to hear it. But what does Manxness? What does Manx identity? What does that actually mean to you as a Manxman?
It's a very deep pool to fish in, really, is what I would think about. I don't know. Over the years, I've read so many things. The work by an academic apprentice down at Swansea and on Manx identity and Manxness and so on. I think it's something that's forever changing. I think it's something that is forever challenged by new things that comes along, by population change and so on. But fundamentally, it has so many elements to it. Elements of poetry, of music, of dance, of images and imagery, of history, of castles, a whole range of things like that. The language is there as part of it too. So it's a very rich, I called it a pool, a tapestry would be another way of calling it. But geographically, I guess the having done a degree back in the 1970s as a geographer, the Isle of Man sort of stands out as being crucial in terms of understanding the Irish Sea Basin, quaternary stratigraphy and things like that. It's a fascinating area demographically because of the way that even when I was at school, in the data books that we had back at St Ninians as youngsters, we could see that there were only two countries in the world that had more deaths than births. One was Eastern Germany, and the other was the Isle of Man. So it had a sense of this sort of standing apart. And then you pick up on slavery and smuggling and some of the historical things and the perceptions idea. The way that and it was touched on before by both Simons, the way in which the Fast Show portrayed it, and you get perceptions of the Isle of Man, whether that's about some of the aspects of finance and TT, cats with no tail, or the question that what's the name of the Parliament of the Isle of Man comes up on every quiz show if you watch it for more than a few weeks. I think it's a range of all of those things part of it. And
for you, again, as a Manxman, not long elected as a member for the Legislative Council, Tuesday, this coming Tuesday, is going to be a really special day for you.
It will, yes. And when I was first elected by the Keys to Legislative Council, I had a period of 24 hours where I was absolutely stunned. That's the only way I could describe it. I was stunned. And then I began to think about, yes, gosh, I'll be participating in Tynwald Day. And I kind of thought it would be hugely overwhelming emotionally. But as I get nearer to it, that's not the way I feel about it. It'd be an enormous privilege, it'd be a humbling experience, I think. But yes, it's extraordinary. But I've had a number of tickets to pass on to people on the grandstand, and I've had an awful lot of conversations about people who don't attend and the reasons why they don't, and that's been sort of humbling too. But it'll be a tremendous day. I hope the weather's fine, because we did a walk-through on Wednesday, and you could see how exposed members would be and the public would be at that if it's a bad day. But it's tremendous excitement, even down to what happens in the global village and this sense of the diversity of the Isle of Man. Tremendous experience. I was talking to somebody yesterday. He's been setting up the Wi-Fi so that all the stalls can take their money on cards, using machines and so on. And you can see how the whole thing moves forward, each year it moves forward. And that's great.
Which demonstrates our identity is changing, I suppose, in that we're all using cards now and not throwing money in buckets. Chris Thomas, honorary Manxman, certainly. You've I'm not sure how long you've been on the island, but have you noticed any significant change in the time you've been here?
21 years, and change to myself and change in the island as well. And I want to pick up on both of the aspects that have been floated so far. So that in terms of identity, I was fascinated by understanding identity when I first arrived, and I actually enrolled on the Centre for Manx Studies course at the time, and it was so rich to think about identity and how it was likely to be multi-levelled for most people. I'm a man, I'm a father, I'm a husband, but I'm also a little bit Manx now because this is where I live and I serve in the People's Parliament. I'm also British, but so are most Manx people when you think about it, because of the fact we're in the Irish Sea. So I remember writing an essay about how technology was very unlikely to be different in the Isle of Man compared to in Cumbria or in Dublin or in Belfast or in North Wales because of the travel. And that brings us on to the more practical thing, which is the second part of the approach I wanted to think about. And whenever the Isle of Man has thought about greater autonomy or independence, you have to tackle Manxness and identity and feelings about the island and who we are and who people are who come here and so on. But we also have to get very practical. And I noticed, even particularly in recent years while I've been here, that and often it's to do with talking to my own children, there are very practical things that make you think about the island and its autonomy. So, for instance, QR codes, vaccination status, that really affected younger people because all of a sudden going to Leeds Festival wasn't as easy because the Isle of Man was outside the NHS vaccination system, and that's a practical thing that we've got to think about when we tackle identity and practical things and greater autonomy. Border control. There are people in the island who are passionate about the idea you can get on the ferry and shop in Liverpool One, go to a concert, go to a sports fixture without any documents, but the COVID period showed us that it's possible for the island to end up with a border around it. And so that's become something that we've all got to think about, and whether we want a border or we don't want a border with Liverpool and with the other places around us. And post-Brexit, all of a sudden the Isle of Man has opportunities or risks in respect of participating in trade and other international agreements, very practical things like, do we want our driving licence to be entirely Manx, or do we want it to be useful when we go to other places because it's recognised, and we have to make trade-offs along those lines. So essentially, what I put in my own manifesto for the election, it was now time for us to look again at the conclusions that were reached in November 2000. And the Constitution, Legal and Justice Committee, Legal Affairs and Justice Committee has taken up that challenge. And so far what they've got is a published response from the Cabinet Office External Relations team about where we are 21 years on from the November 2000 consideration of independence. And I just would encourage you to reflect on that on your programme, not necessarily today, but in coming months, because it would be great to have a reflection 21 years on about what all the changes that have happened actually mean for us, whether we come to the same conclusions now or whether we need to flex our autonomy, our possibilities for autonomy and international representation directly rather than indirectly.
You're listening to Perspective with me, Phil Gorn, and I'm joined by guests Dr Simon Collister, Simon Maddrell, Minister Chris Thomas and Paul Craine MLC.
Chris, if I can just pick up on that point as well, because one of the other initiatives that I'm involved in is a new think tank called Reatus, which is really looking at kind of how we can build a more prosperous and powerful vision for the island. And one of the things that we've been doing actually is reviewing the 2000 Tynwald report that you just mentioned. And what's fascinating is that it does mention Manxness or kind of the Manx identity as potentially a really powerful indicator for the strength of feeling towards achieving greater autonomy. But what's also really interesting, it says but there's no it's not been quantified, and there's no real kind of tangible benefits of identity or Manxness. So we're going to discount this from our review. And I'm paraphrasing the report, but I found it fascinating because, again, we know from say, a place branding perspective that there are economic benefits in terms of kind of a distinct brand and identity. We know from the literature on kind of economic development and political science that particularly small states that have a distinct identity generally have better economic growth, because there tends to be greater resilience against external variables and headwinds, which sometimes sweep through and affect small states more adversely than large states. So there's a whole body of evidence that kind of points towards strong and kind of distinct identities are good for the economy, good for community resilience. And we did see that during COVID, the way that the community came together and supported one another, which was great. And there was a big play on the kind of the Manxness of the response and whichever way you throw me line. So that was great to see. So, it's there, it's underlying. And we know that there can be tangible benefits if you go and look for them and measure them. So I think that was a bit of a missed trick, or a bit of a gap in that 2000 report, and definitely something that should kind of be revisited.
Yeah, Simon, I think obviously as a brand expert, do you not think that the island is missing out a lot in terms of all of the opportunities that it has in terms of food, wildlife, place, language, folklore? And, to give you some examples, everybody knows Manx kippers. You can only buy one sort of Manx kippers across. But we lost Manx ices. Isle of Man was one of the only two regions in the whole of the British Isles that made ice cream with cream and eggs. There's Cornwall and the Isle of Man, and then all of a sudden Haagen-Dazs came in, and that opportunity was missed, and it's never really been recovered in terms of, and internally there's a lot of great stories. There's ones that sadly have failed, like Manx whiskey being taken to court for its colourlessness, but fantastic brands like Finoddery. But if you look at Manx kippers, you look at Lockton lamb. I mean, for God's sake! I mean, one of the greatest lambs you could eat in the world. And why is it not in a dozen Michelin-starred restaurants across and in France and elsewhere?
There's a lot to say about that. I think. I'm not gonna. I'm gonna not knock what's being done, because I don't want to. Because there's a lot of great work that is being done. But I think you're right. Again, there are perhaps some opportunities that we could do more with. And I think, for me, I think you're kind of covering two strands. One is about the kind of the brand, partly from a tourism and the kind of destination marketing perspective. And I think I remember reading some of the data from Visit last year that said that kind of awareness levels for UK holiday destinations, kind of the Isle of Man, was towards the bottom of that. So there's definitely more that could be done in terms of awareness, and part of that is also about being distinctive. And how do you achieve a distinctiveness? Well, you have a very distinctive brand, and you do lots of work with media. And we've certainly got those stories, as you allude to. And to be fair, the Extraordinary Stories creative work is wonderful. Could we do more with it? Well, yeah, we probably could. We've just had kind of a period where the island's borders were closed, which is not been helpful at all. But I think certainly, we talk about differentiation, and if you look at the Irish Sea basin, as Paul's already alluded to, in terms of landscape, in terms of things to do, you look at Northern Ireland, you look at Wales, you look at Scotland, you look at Ireland, there isn't a huge differentiation, so we can do more with that. But we can also play on distinctiveness, which does go into those stories that you just talked about. And the Isle of Man has stories and kind of that rich kind of tapestry of culture and heritage that other places share some parts of, but don't quite have what the island has. And I think the other side to that is the trade and investment side of it, which, again, I think, your point about Lockton sheep. I saw a great piece of content being put out by the Scottish government. One of their business bodies was all about this great story around somebody that was kind of making woolen products on Shetland. But it was just straight up wool, and it was lovely, great website, great stories, great products. And I was thinking, Like we've got our own kind of distinct domestic breed of kind of ancient sheep, like that we do stuff with. Like, why am I seeing Shetland but not the Isle of Man? So I think there's more we could do there in terms of international promotion, international engagement.
I guess my specific question though is, if we think about products, and this is for anyone on the panel, is to what degree is the lack of control that the Isle of Man has? I could tell you lots of stories about people that have tried to get international trade for things like Lockton, and the opportunities for Manx cheese. Okay, you can buy it in Canada and occasional at Morrison stores, but to what degree is the opportunity there for the Isle of Man to be able to free up trade in order to be able to take advantage of these products that absolutely are premium, will attract a premium price, and could put and of course we'll have all these other benefits of people therefore creating an interest for both investment and for visiting the island. And
so, Chris Thomas, I mean, you've been around a bit in Tynwald. Have you seen anything in Tynwald, in Isle of Man government, that would help with using our national characteristics, cultural characteristics, to benefit the island?
I think so. It has to be a strength, and it can be used as a strength. I hate to be Thomas-like and slightly doubting, but the issue that we have always is the smallness and the insularity of the island, in as much as we are an island. So another essay I wrote 20 years ago was I came to the conclusion that the Isle of Man was continentally insular, and we're also at the edge of the continent. So it is great to imagine those distinctive, brilliant Manx characteristics being the basis of a huge brand. But the reality is that we've got to pick and choose, because we need to get inside trade agreements, and we need to get inside marketing routes, and we need to do all the practical things. So I do think we need to work together and focus, and that's where Culture Vannin comes in, for instance, because things about which I have the privilege to chair, things about the general cultural identity and the traditions and all of that, I think are done pretty well now. I think that we have massive hits in terms of our videos, and then it comes down to working, with the UK at the moment to make sure that the trade arrangements are put in place would allow the sorts of things that Simon's talked about, and also that we're realistic. Because somebody told me recently, red meat was much harder than you first think, because red meat's not exactly a growing habit. It's actually a declining habit, and there's already some massively established brands. So perhaps it wouldn't be quite as easy for Lockton sheep or for a whiskey than you first think. Being unique is not exactly all you need. You need much more than that. You need to take into account these situations. So we have to be very, very careful.
And we heard reference earlier there to the Scottish government and the Shetland Islands. The Scottish government has dropped a nice little grenade into the politics of the United Kingdom, which is already exciting. Suggested that maybe it's time for a second independence referendum. I'm going to ask you as a minister to speculate a bit on the what-if basis. What if actually the Scottish people decide that they've had enough with the United Kingdom and do decide they want to go for independence, assuming, of course, that the referendum can be declared and legal? What happens then in terms of the Isle of Man's relationship with the rest of the United Kingdom and Scotland? Has there been much consideration of that?
I don't think there's been much consideration beyond the consideration that's been going on every year for decades. I do think the constitutional investigation handled by the Tynwald Committee will grow into something else, and it's been started off in the right way by asking government to reflect on what it concluded 20 years ago, and I think that's a significant piece of work, because often government initiatives start as Tynwald committees. I'm Minister of Infrastructure. I don't speak for External Relations Department and so on, but I will go back, because I used to be in Cabinet Office, although I wasn't Minister of Cabinet Office, and I did have the privilege to chair some British Irish Council sessions and to participate in one other, and that was up in Scotland. And I do remember at the time I was so impressed that the Scottish Government got the original Treaty of Perth out for me, open on the page, which was the Isle of Man bit when the transaction took place. And we did have some pretty high-level discussions about...
And effectively, for those who don't know the Treaty of Perth, effectively that suggests that were Scotland to become an independent nation, the Treaty of Perth allowed the Isle of Man to be brought into the British Crown establishment through Scotland. So potentially that means we would be a Scottish Crown dependency as opposed to a British one.
I'll leave that to a constitutional international lawyer types and relations. But what I would say is I understood what was going on, which was that from a Scottish perspective, we have more autonomy than they do already, and we seem to have done a lot with the amount of autonomy. And it was a discussion. And then the second point I wanted to make is that I would definitely be a target for a Scottish independence referendum as a voter. So Scottish identity is all been about including come-overs and stay-overs and stop-overs into the referendum vote. So the work of identity formers and identity politics has been absolutely vital, because it was realised by the SNP a great many decades ago that the only way to do it was to stress practical things of Scottish independence and to build a consensus amongst all sorts of people in Scotland, not people who were already independence seekers in the 1960s, if you see what I mean.
Paul Craine, building on Minister Thomas's point, Chris Thomas's point, the Manx people are more likely to support greater autonomy for the island, or independence, or whatever you want to call it, if there's a clear case for that. Do you think people are even in the slightest bit interested at the moment with in relation to our constitutional relationship, or is that the role of politicians to explain how changes in our constitutional relationship can actually potentially bring certain benefits? So, for example, helping people to manage with the cost of living crisis at the moment, things like this.
I think people are interested, and I think that sort of blows hot and cold, and I think it blows in both directions. So for every person you hear saying the Isle of Man should be completely independent and going its own way, you hear someone else saying we should be a county of England, which really hurts when you hear it being said. But I think the discussion has reached some interesting points. It's a crucial time here. I have never been a fan of the Isle of Man separating out further. I've been happy enough, especially over these last 50 years. UK was in the European Union, and the Isle of Man had a link with that. We had this customs union with the UK, and it seems to have served as well. But some of these things have changed, haven't they? The idea of the Scottish independence vote, Chris talked about them being perhaps behind us in terms of autonomy. In some ways, they will overtake us in terms of their autonomy. And one of the areas that I think about, I know it's come up before in your time in the Keys and in Tynwald, about the idea of the territorial sea and whether the Isle of Man should have access to an exclusive economic zone, which, if that applied, then the sea area that we have of about 4,000 square kilometres would increase by another 3,000 odd square kilometres. It would actually take in the Morgan wind farm site, which is currently under consultation. So there's parts of the Irish Sea that are nearer to the Isle of Man than they are to the UK. We cannot at the moment have an economic zone to cover that because we're not a sovereign nation. And that raises the question of, okay, we're not a sovereign nation, but in our relationship with the United Kingdom, there was a decision that we wouldn't have access to this, even though we're the nearest land to it. It raises an interesting question.
Just to help the listener understand what the answer to that interesting question might be, there's quite a lot of potential income for the Isle of Man were that territorial seabed actually part of our territory rather than the UK's.
That's right. And then there was talk about trade agreements there, and the decision for the United Kingdom to have Brexit, to leave the European Union, has left us with far fewer trade agreements. The UK at the moment is trying to build free trade agreements. The Isle of Man, because we're not a sovereign state, we're not able to create our own free trade agreements, which comes back to some of the things that, that, Simon was saying about Manx products and so on. So every time there are trade agreements being made by the UK, the Isle of Man has to sort of fight its corner. There's a risk that it'll be forgotten or left out, or that some particular interest in that trade agreement would pass us by. So we've got that in there. And then we've got the modern Bill of Rights going through or being consulted on in the UK at the moment, which would take away the European Convention of Human Rights to the UK and presumably to us too, but we don't have a say in that. So although I'm committed to our links with the UK, I can certainly see reasons why we might want to explore where this goes. And the Scottish independence vote, if it comes off, I know there's a proposed date for October next year. It may not happen. I would ordinarily have been a fan of 2/3 majority to make a constitutional change, but that's not the way it seems to run. If that were to lead to Scottish independence, I think it will have considerable impact on the way we perceive ourselves, and that's perhaps a crucial part to it.
And Simon Maddrell, do you think the white knuckle ride, which is British politics at the moment, do you think that all the instability and the scandals and things that seem to surround British politics, is that likely to influence Manx people's thinking when they think about greater autonomy or even independence?
Well, one would hope so, and one would think so. I mean, I alluded to it earlier, that the sort of the irony of the original Scottish independence vote and the Brexit vote is that the English argument against Scottish independence was the absolute opposite argument that they used for Brexit, and there are a lot of people with a lot of, somehow for me, feel far too involved in a belief that Boris Johnson should remain. But if they fully embraced his rhetoric, then taking back control is exactly, or achieving greater control, as Chris would see it, should be the way. But I think there's a danger of the carpet and the floor coming from underneath our feet, as if I speak as a Manxman, because it isn't just Scottish independence. There are many people in the UK and here that are concerned about that so-called ceremonial role that the Crown has. And that's something we've not really talked about in terms of the real power that the Crown has. And it's becoming increasingly a voice that's going to get louder and louder in the UK when the Queen finally passes on, which won't be too far away from what they are saying. And from that perspective, there is a strong belief with the constitutional experts across that Prince Charles is going to take a much more active role as king, interfering with the politics. And that therefore, when you turn up on Tuesday, the ceremonial role that the governor has won't necessarily be the same, that's we may find that the role of the Crown in the UK is going to, and I would encourage that to be a real consideration in terms of the Isle of Man being on the front foot in that regard, because it's equally about that fundamental principle of someone so-called not having control over what we do. And you may have seen in the news last week, Prince Charles secretly changing a law to create an exemption for a village that he owned, and that may be, but the principle of that is that we do live under a monarchy, and is that what we want as a nation, and as a proud Manxman, even though I am living across, I would, for me, the Manx should be independent. I mean, to the degree that do we really want to be painted with the brush of racism that the English do? You talk about reputation, you talk about how people see you. Well, them across have got the worst reputation in the world, and human rights and breaking international law and all of those things. Do we want to be part of that? Do we want to sink with them?
And then I suppose Chris Thomas, we're talking about taking back control. there's not an awful lot left for us to take back control of, is there?
That's right. So the post office has been an independent Isle of Man post office for 50 years now. We have our own cultural organisation. That I just mentioned those two because they're two bodies I chair. We have financial autonomy. The UK basically lets us represent ourselves when we ask them to, and we can be entrusted to do lots of things. And that's the position of the external affairs of the Isle of Man government. That we will look at these things and we'll make sure that we have the right amount of international representation and the right amount of autonomy that suits us. We had a fascinating session with Professor Edge recently when he talked about social security negotiations in the 1950s. The Isle of Man was allowed to go and put in place its own social security administration laws, and for whatever reason the Isle of Man was trying to do the same one for the north of the island, of the Republic of Ireland, and the Republic of Ireland as well, which was a bit tricky. So in the end, we walked away from it. Professor Edge told us the story of that. The only reason I mention that is because the position of the Isle of Man government is that we can do what we want to do, and it's our choice. And so therefore, I think it's important that we reflect properly on what extra things we could have control of as part of getting greater autonomy, and whether or not our scale and our sense of identity and all of the practical things that we've begun to identify actually justify that or not. Because at the end of the day, there are people here who like the idea they can get on the steam packet and go to Liverpool with no checks as if they were here, and there are people who feel British as well as Manx, and there are, I would say, more people who feel themselves monarchist rather than Republican on the Isle of Man. So we've got to work it out for ourselves. And at my age, I'm of the view that ideology and identity is probably going to come out less importantly for most people than practical things like that. But at the very least, we ought to look at all of the practical things and see where we are in terms of those practical questions.
And again, in terms of practicalities, if in essence the Isle of Man government chooses to allow or to ask the United Kingdom to act on our behalf in relation to foreign affairs and travel matters, it's a pragmatic decision on the part of the Manx government.
It costs us lots of money to have Manx versions of the British passport. We pay more and more for that as international terrorism and international fraud has got greater. It costs us more and more per capita to do that, but we think it's worthwhile, but we need to ask the question from time to time. That could be part of the argument why there are people who talk about counties. Each time they get angry because they waste half an hour because what is this passport?
But have you got a choice about having a different passport? Because you
have in the Isle of Man, you can actually apply to Belfast or Liverpool to get a passport. You don't actually have to have a Manx passport. I've got a Manx British passport. Pretty much everybody here knows, but you can actually if you're from the Isle of Man.
And if you were born in the Isle of Man and you've got Manx and your parents,
that's gone.
Your parents were born in the Isle of Man, you can become a British citizen, can you?
Well, no, that's things have changed to some extent with Protocol 3, because obviously the rights that were stamped on your passport to do with the EU aspects of it. But what I'm saying is that in actual fact at the moment, if you lived here on the Isle of Man, if you wanted to, you could apply to one of the other passport offices and get a passport. Mm-hmm. People do that. It takes longer than it does to go here, but it's just a question that people have got to ask. I'm not advocating any changes, but all I'm explaining is that the cost of actually having a passport with the differences has got greater through time because of the fact that we now have, terrorists and fraud and identity theft and all of that is much greater, and it's like that with everything to do with. But essentially, the legal system is where it starts. We can't have our own laws without our own parliament. Once you've got your own parliament, you've got your own. It's chicken and egg, but I hate the use of the word jurisdiction, but so much of the island's nature goes back to the fact that we make our own laws inside our own parliament, and then we determine our own laws inside our own legal system, and that in itself is a fundamental part of our identity. So you talked about the TT before. The reason we could have the TT in 1904 was because we could vary our road traffic laws things. The reason we could do things in the 18th century was because we could vary our taxation procedures, and that's absolutely vital to the island. But now identity and business practices are very different from what they were in the 18th century, because people do travel all over the place, and there can be a resistance to small countries having separate affairs. As driving licences change, our driving licences do look more and more different from a lot of other countries' driving licences, and it might become harder for practical people to hire a motorbike when they're on a Greek island, because our driving licence looks so different from all the other tourists who are there and the like.
And Paul Craine, I mean, you're a geographer at heart, and so the release of the two census reports in recent months must have felt like Christmas come early for you, mustn't it? Have you had much of a chance to look through? Because I suppose now you have a day job as well that you have to worry about. But have you had a chance to look through in terms of how people are identifying in terms of nationality on the island, or?
Yeah, the tables are in there, certainly, although it's interesting, on the nationality table, the previous census had, what it publishes in the census is groups of nationalities. So European residents in the Isle of Man, European nationals, were broken down into those who were EU nationals and outside EU. And of course, this year's census doesn't use the same pattern. It talks about northwest, east and so on. But the interesting patterns that do emerge there are that the percentage of people with Manx nationality or born in the Isle of Man is almost unchanged from 2016, despite the population changes that have gone on. I think the most remarkable thing I've found so far was that I saw some additional data. I asked for some extra data as I do analysis. I saw some extra data on the 6,700 people who moved to the Isle of Man between 2016 and 2021, and those 6,700 people were born on 134 different countries, and that I thought was absolutely remarkable. The degree of diversity that's there in that, absolutely remarkable.
And certainly, there's been a very significant increase. I mean, it's still a relatively small percentage, but a very significant increase in Black, Asian, and minority representation in this latest census.
Yes, you say it's noticeable, but it is small in percentage terms. I think in the 2011 census, so going back 10 years, the percentage of the population born in the Isle of Man, the UK, Republic of Ireland, Channel Islands and so on, was approximately 92.5%. And this time it's just under 90%. So it hasn't been a huge shift in that sense. In terms of birthplace, over 49.5% of the population were born in the Isle of Man, and that's where it's been roughly throughout this century.
And in terms of how people record themselves on the census, I think it's something like 45% describe themselves as Manx, and something like 38% describe themselves as British, which was interesting in relation to this discussion.
Yes, that's right. But if this is the place of birth you're looking at, it will be clear that the 49% born in the Isle of Man were born here. The next group were born in the UK, and so they're the British group. So 49, 38, they're the approximate figures there.
Well, we are sadly running towards the end of our programme, so I want a very sharp and snappy answer from each of you. Sharp in the crisp sense of the word rather than the angry sense. Start with you, Simon Collister. What do you think the chances are that the Isle of Man, well, I suppose the Isle of Man and Scotland in maybe a few years' time will both be independent nations?
Oh, it's a really good question, and I'm going to have to say, without really kind of drawing on any of the evidence or the data or projections, it just feels that the territorial shape of the UK is on a trajectory that is going to change it dramatically. I think, dare I say, it's inevitable.
Chris Thomas?
The trend to greater autonomy will continue, but that doesn't mean that the Isle of Man won't choose to share things with other people.
And Simon Maddrell?
Yeah, I think the relationship between the Queen and the rest of the UK itself and Crown dependencies, etc., will significantly change in the next 10 years. And the Isle of Man will be part of that, whether it likes it or not, and hopefully it will be on the front foot.
And last word to Paul Craine?
I can't speak for Scotland on this, but from the Isle of Man's point of view, Yes, I think there are areas that the Isle of Man would like to tweak going forward, but I think it's highly likely we'd stay within the British fold, as it were.
We live in turbulent times, so will the Isle of Man decide to rock the boat further for a potentially brighter future? Or are we better sticking with the current arrangement which has served us well in recent decades? Will the UK survive in its current form? For now, I'm Phil Gorn, Guramaeus and Geisha Grum. Thanks for listening.